Have you seen the news? I'm right-wing now. Let's talk about how right-wing I am and why I'm right-wing.
Ben, thank you for joining me on Under the Skin.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I'm excited to talk to you.
Well, I appreciate that. Back at you.
Have you ever wondered how Jordan Peterson deals with being attacked? How he felt during the tundra of conflict, contradiction and controversy that surrounded him? On my podcast, Under the Skin, Jordan Peterson and I met for our third or fourth conversation and asked him directly how he feels when he knows that his beliefs have provoked or upset people. I had a fantastic conversation with Jimmy Dore, fellow YouTuber, fantastic comedian, brilliant man, independent thinker. You should watch his channel and subscribe to that too.
Tim Pool is a great and influential orator.
If talking about that is right wing, then I'm right wing. Then I'm right wing. Told whether I'm right wing or left wing, then I'm right wing.
You guys seem to be enjoying my video yesterday on the origins of Russell Brand's content and how he politically evolved on YouTube. Now, I did say in that video that was just part one. And a lot of the comments I was getting on that video was specifically talking about how he's become more like Joe Rogan or Jimmy Dore, despite the fact I didn't really talk about that in that video because I was leaving it for this video because I just felt like there's way too much. That video is already nearly 50 minutes long. I don't know how long it's going to be, but we're going to try and maybe keep it under 50 minutes as well. My last video focused a lot on old Russell Brand content. You didn't really see too much modern stuff. Now, today, I kind of want to go through his economic views over his career on YouTube and how that set him up for his current politics, because I don't even really know how to describe his current politics. It's clearly anti-establishment, but then he's praising Tucker Carlson in some things, like Jimmy Dore often does, and he's clearly anti-capitalism, although he doesn't call it capitalism anymore. And through his class reductionism of certain I guess social issues, it's kind of opened him up to talking about more right-wing populist subjects. And as you're going to see in the video, he talks about trusting his audience to make their own decisions on the sources he shows you. But as we're going to see, he often uses fringe right-wing sources and even at times doesn't actually disclose his source and hides it behind news aggregators and news directories, when in reality the author of some of the articles he reads are actually right-wing trolls writing for Russia Today, as you're going to see in the video. Now, Brand says he has a whole team working on his stuff now. It's not just a one-man band like it seemingly used to be. So I don't know how much there is to blame on him specifically, but his show now is more polished, more clickbait, does not actually focus on anything that's really important or substantial, basically just takes a leaf out of Jimmy Dore's, out of Joe Rogan's book, and covers issues that are popular in right-wing populist circles, while seemingly still pretending he's left-wing. And Russell has actually made a whole video talking about allegations he has gone right-wing. So we're going to get into all of that stuff today and go through some of his content like we did in the last video. But before we get any further, my video yesterday was demonetized. I'm not sure if this one will be or not, but if you want to support my work going forward for the future, please consider becoming a patron. I want to build up as many $1 to $3 patrons as possible to make it a sustainable Patreon. And at the moment, you get my Nintendo Switch friend code and you get access to the private patrons Discord server. Also, follow me on social media at the Kavernacle on Twitter and Instagram. Come join our community on my subreddit, link in the description, and check out my second channel where I archive all my live streams, the Kavernacle Extra. So for those of you who have got this far and haven't watched part one, I do advise you to go and watch part one, but I don't believe you actually have to watch part one to watch part two. I just think it's helpful in seeing the origins of Russell's channel and having a case study of how his politics have changed, but we're going to do that today anyway, so go check that out afterwards. So I want to talk about Russell's economic views and mainly how he is pretty much anti-capitalist, although it seems like he doesn't really like to use that language as much anymore. More talk about this stuff without actually calling it anti-capitalism, but it has a long history on his channel. Now, he has a video back in 2014, October 2014, the first year of his news show on YouTube, with a guy called Daniel Pinchbeck, who is someone who believes in shamanism and stuff. Also a guy who's had a lot of controversy I'm not going to talk about, but I think that's kind of irrelevant because the point of this and the point of showing you this is that Russell is platforming someone who is talking about anti-capitalism, and as you'll see in the clip I'm going to show you, they talk about materialism, challenging corporations, and how to stop ecological disaster by essentially ending capitalism.
We have to be aware of the broader problem, because my understanding is if there were, what I sort of believe, perhaps naively, is if there was a philosophical change that led to economic change, i.e. that we confronted corporations, regulated their power and prevented their continuing tyranny, that in itself would make a difference on a broad global scale. But that, you're saying, won't be insufficient unless I also make an individual change, which is much harder because it involves more than just talking. Now, Buckminster Fuller, he said this thing: to make the world work for 100% of humanity in the shortest time possible through spontaneous cooperation without ecological offence or the disadvantage of anyone. I really like that. It's like a haiku of what we need to do, because when I read that, it makes me realise, there's loads of systems that we have in place that are to the disadvantage of loads of people, that cause ecological offence simply because they make a lot of money for a few people, the 65 people that have as much wealth as the 50% of the people on the planet that are poorest.
People on the bus, in the gilded bus.
Terrible business.
Now, the stuff about like capitalism causing climate change is something like I fully believe in, but of course, like Russell was talking about it back in like 2014. It's something he does talk about a fair bit on his channel even today. But going on through the timeline, in 2016 he had a video talking about why socialism is cool again, basically framing it in like the progressive wave of someone like Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn being popular while not necessarily shying away from socialism. And in the video he begins it by talking about capitalism and Marxism and where that kind of comes from, like the Protestant work ethic.
A pretty cod and simplistic analysis of capitalism, and the kind of capitalism that we have now is that it's really good at masking, disguising and managing the problems that it creates. I don't know very much about Marxism, but what I do know is he predicted that it was cyclical, self-destructive, would lead to an elite benefiting at the expense of workers, primarily because it comes from an idea of individualism. Some fella called Max Weber says that capitalism isn't primarily an economic idea. He says it's a religious idea and comes from Protestantism, the idea that your personal striving here on this earth leads to being looked upon favourably by God. That capitalism was able to use that as a kind of jet fuel for that economic ideology, because you as an individual are responsible for yourself and your own relationship with God. The idea of community is diminished, and even the idea of family.
I've actually heard people say this a lot. It's something I need to do more research into, about how like the work ethic of Puritan Protestants and how they valued this stuff really played into the formation of modern day capitalism. I'm sure a lot of you in the comments can educate me or maybe point me in the right direction, because I'm glad he touched on this, because it's something I'm still very curious about. But yeah, it's clear like Russell doesn't really like capitalism, and though Russell's not getting up on like a podium and talking about Marxism specifically as much as maybe people would want, it's pretty clear from even back in the day Russell is someone who is more sympathetic to left-wing ideologies and critiques of capitalism specifically. But when he's talking about it back here, it feels like it's a lot more like measured and rational. While he's talking about it in 2022, it mainly verges into conspiracy theories a lot of the time, and his critiques of like capitalism actually come from like a right-wing populist mindset, which isn't really anti-capitalist in my view, but we're going to get back to that a bit later. So he continues this for a long time, and I appreciate how he's probably like convinced a lot of people that capitalism is bad. So in September 2017 he posts a bit of his radio show where he talks to someone called Professor David Harvey. Now the thing I just want to skip to, this is like an hour-long like podcast style interview, is at 14 minutes 15 seconds where he talks about capitalism causing climate change essentially, and how Russell talks about how these things are often placed on the individual when it's systemic issues of capitalism that are actually causing these things.
When I was talking to Al Gore, I kept thinking, and in fact saying, yeah, but hold on a minute, if you need that to stop, can't you, isn't there got to be sort of some stern and definitive regulation of that, otherwise it will just carry on, like, and in this case like defiant and absolute regulation of energy companies, certain kinds of trade, certain kinds of labour. So in capital, is it dealing with, like, saying, well, there's no point just asking people to, turn the tap off while they clean their teeth? It's much more important to say, well, you can't have that amount of profit. You can't operate in that way. Is that what is that? Does that critique reach those kind of conclusions?
That's a very good point. I mean, my view of Al Gore is that he thinks that you can actually solve the climate change problem within the parameters of a capitalist system, and that he doesn't want to do away with capitalism. He's trying to protect capitalism from the consequences of climate change.
Yeah.
Whereas I take the view that the main producer of climate change is, of course, the driving force of capital accumulation. And until you've dealt with the driving force of capital accumulation, you're going to get all these promises about new technologies which are going to solve the problem and so on. But you're not going to get a fundamental kind of a solution without challenging capital itself.
So it's kind of futile, isn't it? And it's sort of using the means of a kind of a contemporary consumer society, in that it's about your individual choice, and you should individually recycle and individually make these kind of choices.
Right.
But I still find him platforming that guy really interesting, and him talking about how capitalism is causing climate change interesting, because I feel like a lot of people are still very much in denial about that. And they reference Al Gore in this because Russell has talked to Al Gore multiple times about this, but Al Gore is a capitalist who believes the solution against climate change and to end climate change or defeat climate change or whatever is within the capitalist system. And as we are seeing throughout the world, capitalism is not going to save us from climate change, because capitalism is a death cult. People will keep using fossil fuels, they'll keep using oil, they'll keep, burning coal because it's more profitable in the short term. And capitalism is mainly concerned with short-term profits. It's not about long-term sustainability. They will burn something out and move to the next scam or the next thing they can make a lot of profit in, and they will destroy whole communities and then up and leave. This has happened a lot of times, and destroy whole environments and up and leave and go do it again somewhere else. Capitalism does not care about sustainability, and that's why capitalism is literally causing the destruction of human civilization right now. Now, even in 2021, he does get on interesting economists to talk about capitalism and talk about how it's a system that is inherently exploitative. He has a professor called Anwar Sheikh on as well to talk about these things.
In this country, post-Brexit, a lot of hospitality industry, they have trouble now finding labour, low-paid labour for the positions that I guess would have conventionally been fulfilled by migrant labour. At least that's one narrative that's being offered, and I mean this anecdotally as well as sort of more broadly culturally. When I was talking to my friends, I'm like, that would have restaurants or whatever, and I'm like, why don't you pay them people more money then? That's surely that's the threshold. And we can't afford to pay them more money because our business. And I'm like, well, then isn't your business sort of artificially held together by a requirement for poverty? And what kind of business is that? So what kind of, in that micro example, what kind of critique of capitalism is available, and what does those little examples tell us?
What I've argued throughout my work, which admittedly is not exactly written in a popular style, is that capitalism has these recurrent patterns. And I show very concretely, for instance, that what I call great depressions occur in a recurrent manner.
So that is all well and good, and I praise Russell for someone at least who tries to platform people who have an interesting take on anti-capitalism, right? But now I want to get into the problems of often the conversations he has around capitalism. Now, I made a whole video about the anti-woke left, Carl Kalinske, Crystal Ball, these types of class reductionists. Now, class reductionist leftists often just prioritize economic reforms and strengthening the working class and giving them more democracy and things like that over actually addressing things they see as, mired in identity politics. So they don't want to divide people by tackling things that are inherently controversial or polarizing, even though they need to be tackled, because they feel if you take a broad populist approach focused on economics instead of identity politics, that's how you're going to solve things. Now, as I said in my video criticizing that stuff, there are so many issues in society that need you to specifically target them, and whether it's controversial or not, it needs to be done, because not everything can be boiled down to class and economics, especially a lot of social views, especially a lot of inherent bigotry that historically goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, even before the formation of modern capitalism. You can't just boil it all down to this stuff. But Russell is someone who, in my opinion, does this a lot, and that can kind of explain how he can be someone who may come from left-wing anti-capitalist views, but really starts to buy into the right-wing framing of populism and really cultivating a right-wing audience instead of a left-wing audience who might be more sympathetic to his own critiques on capitalism. So this guy's pretty famous on social media, like lefty social media, Yanis Varoufakis, and he appeared in a video of Russell on September 2020, but the title of the video is called "The Working Class versus Social Justice Warriors." I've constantly said social justice warrior is not a thing that exists. It's not real. It's just the right-wing framing of people who often care about social issues. I completely reject this framing. So they begin the video by talking about SJWs versus the traditional left.
Is the obvious fissures that exist among what would once have been thought of as the left, most notably in the emergence of the SJW social justice movement, and how abstracted and often opposed they are from the traditional working class or blue collar support of left-wing movements, who I think it's safe to say now feel wholly estranged from the parties that were at least superficially augmented to serve them.
And then they go on to talk about how the traditional working class is being left behind, and how Jeremy Corbyn and people like him were brought down by the weaponization of identity politics, and how urban leftists need to be more respectful to, like, I don't know, the white working class or something.
Do you think it's possible to resolve the fissure that exists between sort of the more metropolitan, social justice, identity politics oriented members of progressivism and the now left behind working class blue collar people that now feel sort of not only resentful towards establishment power, but perhaps even more resentful to these kind of movements that make them feel culturally alienated and often demonize working class people as one of their dominant motifs?
But look at the way in which Corbyn was brought down, through the weaponization of identity politics, and until and unless younger, more liberal, more urbanite, and more upwardly mobile leftists can start paying their dues and be more respectful to those who have been held behind and left behind in the Rust Belt areas, or in, you know, the Clactons-on-Sea areas and the Bournemouths areas of the world, unless we have a genuine, sympathy of one another, it can't work.
Russell and Yanis then go to talk about, like, how they agree it's good to have, like, social reforms, but it's not really going to solve the problems.
What we must understand is that when somebody is about to lose their job in a factory, or they've lost it, it really offers them no succor. It offers them no satisfaction to hear that Yale University now is called something else.
It's interesting how that example cuts to the heart of the issue of symbolic cultural change versus meaningful economic change, and in a sense it ossifies that estrangement between working, inverted commas, traditional Labour voters. The Labour Party, Labour is a synonym for work, for industrialised people working in industrialised jobs, people who 50, 60 years ago were told that there is such a thing as Britain, that Britain is separate and it is worth laying down your life for.
I hope you've seen in those clips, like, my problem with this stuff in terms of, like, dismissing social reforms and prioritising economic reforms, because even with issues like of cultural issues like statues or naming universities things, I think that's important, but you can also walk and chew gum. Why do we have to say, stop talking about that, just talk about economics? Because I guess as an electoral strategy, what these people see is like, well, we can only win votes with potentially bigoted people if we focus on the economic side. And they talk about, like, having respect for the working class, but I feel like with these people, the working class, I tweeted about this today, is often a bit of a dog whistle for, like, white manual labouring man, where we know in society some of the poorest working class people are actually manual labouring minority women in Western white societies. That is true in England and places like London. Often black working women are some of the poorest in the country. But these people think, like, if you try and tackle the racial issues of the disparity in wealth, you're a social justice warrior. You're focusing on identity politics. But how do these people think the bigotry will be solved? Like, if everyone is more equal economically, if we have worker co-ops, like I said in my Karl Kalinske video, if we have better economic reforms, universal healthcare like we have in the UK, the prejudices and the disparity won't go away. You have to eventually talk about things like reparations. That's an uncomfortable conversation for a lot of people who have inherent bigotry, isn't it? But you're going to have these conversations if you actually care about like the liberation of people who have traditionally suffered oppression. Yes, you do have to have a broader approach sometimes in electoral politics for sure. But like I've said across my videos, electoral politics isn't everything. Think about Stonewall, for example, an example I used last time. Having this big riot against the police to stand up for LGBT rights. Not popular, but this helped people rise up and stand up for their civil rights. Like, I personally really disagree with class reductionism, and I believe you can talk about both these things. Like, you can do both these things. They feel like it will alienate people, but at the same time, reference Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders. Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders did also talk about identity politics. I don't know where this like myth comes from that Jeremy Corbyn specifically never talked about identity politics. He always talks about identity politics. He always talks about like different marginalized groups in society. He's pretty well loved in his community by like Jewish and Muslim groups and stuff like that because he specifically speaks out on issues that affect them. Yanis is not like the worst person ever, but then Russell does platform some weird people to talk about economics. So he has this guy, and I had to look him up because I'd never heard of him. So on his Twitter profile, I think this says everything you want to know about him. He's called Jonathan Haidt. And the first tweet I saw of him was, I was saddened to read a student's account how the intellectual climate has changed at UVA since I left in 2011 when it was wonderful. Do you remember that New York Times article about that conservative student saying they were being censored because people didn't like her conservative politics? Yeah, this is what this guy is talking about. And Russell has brought him on to talk about how left-wing SJWs essentially have sold out the working class. So in the video, he talks about how the left used to be focused on class issues. And he talks about all the battles the left won, but that has historically turned people off, and they failed to talk about the real economic issues.
In the US, we had the civil rights movement beginning really in the 50s and spectacularly successful in the 60s. We then get women's rights, gay rights, animal rights, gay marriage, LGBT, transgender. So we've had a real it is clearly the left fighting for liberation from oppression. But I think they kind of took a wrong turn as they got so focused on, quote, marginalized groups. They began to engage in a lot of symbolic politics, still using a kind of a Marxist or Foucaultian sort of language. And so now it's about things that really turn people off. Like in the United States, for a while, it was all about bathrooms and who gets to use which bathrooms. When all the while inequality is rising and the working class is doing terribly.
Then Russell responds by talking about the culture wars and the white working class versus identity groups, and saying the powerful do not care about that stuff because this creates needless conflict between people.
The establishment will ultimately always yield on civil rights issues because it does not affect the nucleus of their power, which is financial and economic. If you start to approach that power basis, that nucleus of power, they will resist it. And sort of, when I consider the cultural wars and where it takes place, the conflict it causes between, let's say, the conventional constituency of leftist parties, i.e. white working class or white people or people of that class of all colours, and the emergent identity groups whose rights necessarily are being promoted, of course. But this is where true alliances ought to be taking place, because the powerful remain ultimately unaffected by these transitions, whereas there's this sort of layer of society where all this sort of frankly needless conflict.
Two white guys just talking about how bad identity politics are. So I'm just playing this for you to show you how Russell often platforms people who are class reductionists, and he seems to be a bit of a class reductionist himself. Now, one more thing I want to say before we move on to show you how this manifests itself in more like right-wing news stories, is that Russell often clickbaits things that seem more conspiratorial. So he clickbaited something about the New World Order, and then when you see something like that and a title like that, you automatically have like a red flag go up in your mind. But the actual video is just him talking to Jason Hickel, who's a professor at ICTA UAB and a visiting senior fellow at LSC, and they essentially just talk about like capitalism and stuff. Like, it's really not this like big conspiracy.
E.g., 1 billion people are living on less than $1 a day, and the one that sort of always clumps me in the face when I read it: the richest 8 people in the world control the same amount of wealth as the poorest half of the world's population.
Yeah, that's a killer fact. It's horrible. So I want to go to the poverty number that you just mentioned. So in order to achieve the most basic levels of human subsistence, to achieve normal human life expectancy, to have a decent chance of surviving past your 5th birthday, et cetera, you have to have at least $5 per day, right? As like a moral minimum. They call this the ethic. So here's the thing: if you measure global poverty at that level, then it's not 1 billion people in poverty. It's 4.3 billion people in poverty, which is 60% of the world's population.
But I think Russell obviously has a team working with him. I don't know their politics, but they often clickbait a lot of these podcasts or like radio shows with more like right-wing conspiratorial framing, just to get more people, I guess, to click on them. But that means when you have like a quick flick over Russell's channel, it does just look like totally insane for the most part. But if you click on some of the videos, they're not actually that crazy. Again, I feel like it's for clickbait. So now I want to move over to Russell buy into like right-wing populist framing and stuff. So he has talked about the Canadian trucker protest and calling it the Freedom Convoy. And he's very, very supportive of these things. And we're going to get into the problems of this. You're going to notice that the source he's citing in the video doesn't seem like it's even a real source. So basically, he says in this video that he agrees with the right of people to protest and basically talks about people coming together. He says he wants to like support people's right to protest and communicate.
The Canadian freedom truckers have kept on trucking for freedom. Why does the legacy media want to convey them so negatively and smear them? Now, this Canadian freedom convoy, people don't like talking about it, do they? And they also like misrepresenting it. Even I talked about it. I've done a video this week. If you watched it, I'll throw to it at the end, And when it was talked about on Twitter, people just took the YouTube short and used that and right wing. So for the record, obviously, if this trucker convoy were to descend into violence, antipathy, hatred and loathing, I wouldn't support that. But what I do agree with is the right of people in a democracy to have a voice, the right of people to protest, to have an opinion, to communicate peacefully.
And then he starts reading out an article and he doesn't cite an author and he says it comes from the source of Muckrack. Any of you guys heard of Muckrack before? A couple of you might have heard of Muckrack. We're going to get into that at the end of this little coverage. So then Russell goes on to say about how he's all for social justice and he hates bigotry.
One of the things I've worked out as a result of my conversations on Under the Skin and as a result of our continuing news reporting on our channel here is that there are certain issues that if you continue to promote them around social justice issues, around which I am actually extremely sympathetic because I really believe in people's right to be whoever they are, and I'm appalled by racism and prejudice and hatred. It's just something that I cannot abide. By highlighting these issues and amplifying these issues, you are able to cause discord and distrust and malevolence when in fact, whether you're in a minority ethnically or sexually or a majority sexually or ethnically, your interest will be determined by economics to a huge degree. And as long as you are at odds with one another on that basis, then you are not going to be able to radically reorganize society in a way that is meaningful. I've noticed it again and again, and it's time that we took responsibility for stopping it by being very loving and accepting and tolerant to one another and of one another, regardless of identity and identification.
But then he secretly uses this article, which is actually written by a right-wing bigot, and then he just starts talking about like more class reductionist stuff.
Isn't it time to accept that some people want their voice to be democratically heard and are willing to protest in order to get it? People want to be included in the running and governance of their country. They want the right to be free. These are what would be called human rights, resourced from religious and spiritual traditions, but also deeply felt by all of us, wherever we're from, however we identify. We have more in common than we have that separates us, and certainly more than we have to oppose each other around.
And he also talks about like what media sources should we use and what do you like?
That the organisers felt the need to hold a press conference for only trustworthy media speaks volumes about the death of public trust in the legacy media. How do you feel about it? Let us know in the comments below. What media sources do you like? Do you use? Who do you trust? What do you want to see us do more of? Is there anyone we can turn to, ally with? What do you think?
So while I was setting up the class reductionist stuff for that framing, is that Russell basically thinks like a lot of issues now, like whether that be Israel-Palestine, like I mentioned in my last video, whether that be a lot of things, are very, very polarizing, and they split the average everyday person and they turn them against each other when their ire and their hatred should be focused on the elites, on the government, because they're all in bed together, controlling us through capitalism and exploiting us through capitalism, and that's why people like him, Jimmy Dore, Richard Wolff, think these trucker protests, which are astroturfed by hard right conservative movements, often don't even involve any truckers. They think it's some sort of like worker uprising because these people just like seeing people protest and like stick it to the man, not realizing that the people involved in these protests do not really have much in common with left-wing people, probably wouldn't support a lot of left-wing causes, even if we could get them round on economic issues. These are people you really want to ally yourselves with. And if you look at the comment section of some of these videos, please tell me if you think Russell Brand's audience are mainly left-wing people who might be sympathetic to the trucker protests. Now, Russell complains a lot about the media all manipulating us. He does this quite a bit. But Russell in this video is manipulating his own audience by not actually being very honest about where his article comes from. Now, Russell has done this a couple times, but this is the worst example. So I wrote a thread on Twitter about this. I'm just going to read this out for you guys now to see how disingenuous he's being. And for someone who cries about, you know, how we're being manipulated and lied to all the time, well, he's not being very honest with us. So, quick thread on how Russell Brand is potentially just manipulating people on YouTube and hiding his use of right-wing sources to promote the Freedom Convoy. Russell uploaded this video on the 4th of February 2022 in which he promoted the Freedom Convoy, downplaying the politics involved, and he has constantly championed it. Throughout the video, he constantly reads out an article about the convoy that promotes the convoy and basically labels any critics of its right-wing element as smearing it. Notice the source, muckrack. No author is cited. Anyone who has worked in journalism, I used to work in journalism, some of you know, knows that muckrack is not an outlet. It's basically a journalist directory PRs can use. If you're a journalist, you probably have a muckrack with all your articles on it. It is not a news outlet and it's not a news source. E.g., here is Ken Klippenstein's profile, so there you see the profile there. So if muckrack isn't an outlet, where does this article come from? Well, if you type in the text, you will find the article was written by right-wing grifter Ian Miles Chong, who wrote it for Russia Today. I haven't done an extensive deep dive on this looking for dubious sources. Throughout my research for my video, I've seen the grey zone and Russia Today come up and weird sites I've never heard of. Don't know if any journalists follow me, but might be worth investigating. So Russell and Russell's team who make his YouTube videos, why can't you just tell us that this article was written by Russia Today and Ian Miles Chong? Like, why don't you say that? Why are you pretending the source is muckrack? Muckrack isn't an outlet. Muckrack doesn't have writers who write articles. Muckrack just collects what you've written and puts it on your page. So even if you were going to use muckrack as your source of where you found this thing, you would have to click on the actual article and go to the actual page. So the people who made this show and gave Russell these notes, I probably don't believe that Russell did it himself, or maybe he did. They know that this is not the correct way to credit someone. What you would have wrote is Ian Miles Chong, RussiaToday.com. Why don't they do that? Because Russell is trying to hide that these sorts of things are boosted, astroturfed, promoted by the right wing. Ian Miles Chong is right wing. He's a right wing troll. So if you tell your audience, the guy who wrote this article promoting this convoy, which you love as well, and you're bouncing off, talking about like how great it is and how everyone who smears it is bad, you're not disclosing it because you don't want your audience to catch on that you're actually using right-wing outlets to boost your own point of view. And Russell, you get annoyed that people have called you right-wing. That is why people think you're right-wing, because you're hiding your use of right-wing sources to boost your narrative about a right-wing populist movement. So Russell seems to be someone who likes transparency and we should all believe in what he says, and he always cites his sources on screen for us, apart from sometimes he kind of doesn't. So I think I probably titled this video something to do with Joe Rogan. Now, I say Russell Brand is becoming Joe Rogan because he's exhibiting some of the worst qualities of Joe Rogan in that he will platform a lot of people who don't similarly have similar politics to him and just let them speak totally without any pushback. And a lot of these people frame issues in a totally right-wing way. But let's just talk about his own love for Joe Rogan first. So on the 21st of January 2022, he starts talking about how the media are out to get Joe Rogan and says the corporate media hate him because he's challenging them.
Joe Rogan irresponsibly has a successful podcast. Therefore, 270 doctors are condemning him having conversations on that podcast. I think the mainstream media coordinated a response to condemn Joe Rogan and his guest for being irresponsible. But could there be other motivations? Primarily, they don't like that Joe Rogan is so successful. So I was thinking, why don't you sort of see Joe Rogan's success and think, well, I suppose we could do that. We could discuss things at length, allow alternative opinions to be openly discussed, or we could really try and destroy Joe Rogan.
I seriously hate these people thinking Joe Rogan is challenging everyone, right? If Joe Rogan had his own show, which he built up on his own platform that he made, I might buy this a bit more. Joe Rogan has a Spotify contract that's worth $200 million. Exclusive contract, right? This is one of the biggest streaming platforms in the entire world. Joe Rogan is corporate media. Joe Rogan is on the corporate platform. These guys keep him around because they like money. Joe Rogan isn't like some champion for free speech, and people not even liking Joe Rogan isn't even like a free speech issue in my mind. If there's pushback against what he's saying, that is just something people have always done through pressure groups to pressure companies. Russell, in 2014, you literally, like I showed in the last video, promoted a BDS-style campaign against Barclays Bank. Is that suppressing free speech? Is that cancel culture or something? You literally did that. So if people want to do that in terms of Joe Rogan, then they're free to do it. It's not censorship or cancel culture or some sort of free speech battle. If you say stuff and people don't like it, that's not an attack on your freedom of speech. Especially when you've been paid £200 million to speak on someone's platform. Now, talking about sources, he then starts reading stuff about Joe Rogan from The Blaze, which was, a right-wing conservative US outlet started by Glenn Beck.
The media last week widely circulated an open letter to Spotify, allegedly co-signed by 270 doctors that demanded the company take action against podcast host Joe Rogan.
So again, lovely use of sources from Russell here, in that he uses an obscure Russia Today source written by a right-wing troll, and he's also using The Blaze like it's not a big deal. And while he rails against corporate media for having some sort of agenda, The Blaze apparently doesn't, Russia Today apparently doesn't. Now, I talk about the Joe Rogan thing as well because, like with H3H3's old podcast and Joe Rogan's podcast, the problem with what they do is often let their audience hear viewpoints that seem more rational because Joe Rogan either doesn't have the capacity to challenge them or doesn't try and challenge them because he wants to keep it friendly. And that's how you get people, especially back in the day, get more radicalized on YouTube because you watch someone like Ben Shapiro on Joe Rogan's show, or Jordan Peterson, maybe they seem pretty rational. You go down this pipeline where you increasingly see and hear more radicalized viewpoints. Now, the worst thing that Russell Brand has done, he gets Tim Pool on his show to talk about apparent civil war. Now, this is something Tim Pool has been grifting on and pushing for years, but he blames it all on the left wing, nothing about the right wing, always downplays the right wing, actually has some of the worst right wing people in America on his own show where he gives them softball interviews, including Enrique Tarrio. And what does Russell do? Russell, in this YouTube clip, lets him speak for about 10 minutes uninterrupted about how America is descending into civil war, and it's basically all the left wing's fault.
Actually, there's a story right now. A journalist was attacked by anti-fascists in, I believe it was in Portland. There's a video of it. You can actually watch the video of them shoving her to the ground, spraying her with paint and macing her. And right now, if you go on Twitter, all of left Twitter says it was actually the Proud Boys. They are so tribalist on their worldview. They will not accept fault for their own side. And obviously, I think the right has its faults. I think the Proud Boys who show up to fight are causing, equal trouble to a certain degree. And people they have their sides. They want to fight. They're not interested in what is true. They're interested in what they believe, and they're interested in confirmation bias. I think when independent voters start swinging away from Biden, which they are, and they might vote for Republicans, which I don't necessarily think solves any of the problems, you'll end up with a massive reaction on a scale much worse than we saw in 2020 with the riots, because people are entrenched. They don't want to back down from what they believe to be true or their worldview. And I think just one final thought on this, a simple way to explain the difference. I do not think you will ever see a large movement of Trump supporters embracing critical race applied principles, critical race praxis. You will see that the left will obviously be very much in favor of their vision of equity and equal outcomes, and the right won't do that. And so long as you have two governments, fighting over control of one centralized system where they want to implement their moral framework, I think it ultimately ends up with some kind of implosion.
So Russell, the reason people think you're right wing is you have this guy who's a massive anti-left grifter come on your show and you just let him speak and say whatever he wants for about 10 minutes, put that on your YouTube channel and it gets hundreds of thousands of views. Because in my mind, like I said in the other video, Russell is a grifter, not a grifter for money. He's a clout grifter. What do people do when they want to be a clout grifter? They enter the right-wing podcast circuit. Again, I made a video on this, where you just get the ever-rotating slew of guests like Yeonmi Park, Tim Pool, Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro. You get all these people on because it's cross-pollination. You can get the other audiences into your one. And Russell barely even tries to challenge these people anymore. Remember that clip of him challenging Candace Owens? Do you remember that clip? That's something from 3 years ago. He's properly challenging her.
Individualistic culture is in itself destroying the principles at a spiritual, human level of community. Do you not think when people see this economic inequality, this disparity, I'm not talking about hating your little rich friend Lola Bell or whoever it was, you went round to see her nanny and were infuriated by it, but thought, oh, well, maybe one day I'll have my own nanny. Do you not think that economic inequality creates in a human being a sense of injustice, of unfairness? Because people, do you know what, Candice? 90% of people that are rich, do you know why they're rich? They was born rich.
Okay, I can tell you something. I think that economic disparity creates that feeling, but a fundamental understanding in economics can help you.
Do you know
that
the most people that are rich are born rich? It's not like there's a tiny minority of people that are like you that come from a poor background and manage to overcome it. And this is what's a problem I've noticed with a lot of great people is they sort of believe that their greatness is something that can be replicated, and I don't think it can.
Russell does not do that anymore. So this has led many people to call Russell Brand right-wing. And he actually responded to this saying, so I'm right-wing now, in a video. He seems to not understand why anyone would think this. So about 1 minute in, he acknowledges that loads of his audience are right-wing, but only some are left-wing, and talks about how left-wing parties have sold out.
How am I right-wing? How can people say that? Now, I know loads of you watching this are right-wing. I imagine some of you are left-wing. I imagine many of you are so disenfranchised with modern politics, the modern media, the relationships between media, big business and government, the ineffectualness of democracy, the lies that are continually told in the media, that you no longer identify with any particular political party. What it seems to me that's really being criticised here is that a lot of people have become disenfranchised with what were once regarded as left-wing parties, because the left-wing parties aren't doing enough for ordinary people. And if it were true that a person that was once left-wing has become more sympathetic to conservative narratives, well, if that were true of me, and actually I don't actually think it is, because I think I'm way to the left of any government party anywhere in the world, actually, because I believe in spirituality and solutions that are entirely different and new models that are not contained within those institutions. But if there is a trend towards the popularity of right-wing media, my God, it's a broad one.
So do you see the framing here? Like, he even knows that, like, loads of you are right-wing. Some of you might be left-wing. So Russell already knows that, like, a lot of his audience are now right-wing because of him constantly grifting on, like, medical misinformation, platforming really weird guests, and actually not talking about anything important anymore, just banging on about the same stuff Jimmy Dore and those types do, about Fauci, about the trucker convoy, about all this stuff, because he knows it's popular with the right-wing audience, and it's probably inflating his ego about how many views he's getting now and how many subscribers. He then goes on to talk about how he does like some of what Tucker Carlson says.
I do watch Tucker sometimes. I've really enjoyed his recent videos on why we shouldn't go to war, for example, where on CNN you'll hear pundits wheeled out, often who have vested interest in going to war, to tell you that there should be a war. I'm anti-war. If anti-war makes me right-wing, then I guess I'm right-wing. I don't agree with Tucker on identity politics. I don't agree with Tucker on the issue of homelessness. I see some stuff on that channel. I think, God, that is not me at all. You know, when I spoke to Matt Taibbi on my podcast Under the Skin, he said, we have to read everything. We have to read as much as we can. We can no longer trust any news source. Any.
And although he says he disagrees with some of it, this makes his critiques of capitalism seem really hollow. Tucker Carlson being contrarian on some positions isn't because Tucker Carlson is like a decent guy on some things. This is some guy who's insanely wealthy on the biggest news platform in America, constantly pushes like mask off fash rhetoric to his millions of watchers, and you say you do like him, but some of the stuff you don't like, how do you not realize that Fox News is part of this like capitalist manipulation of people, including Tucker Carlson? Him standing up to Amazon once in a while doesn't make him suddenly a good guy who's anti-corporate or anti-capitalist. So then he outlines all his politics and why he's actually left-wing.
Well, let me tell you some things I believe in. I believe that big tech companies should be really strongly regulated and broken down. I believe that massive companies should pay their taxes in the countries that they make money from. I believe that public health workers, firefighters, police officers, people that do jobs that put their own lives on the line should be properly paid, properly supported, properly trained. I believe that the most vulnerable people in society, the mentally ill, the vulnerable, should be looked after and taken care of. I believe that small businesses should be given every opportunity to thrive. I believe that communities should be run by the people that live in them, and however you identify, sexually, racially, religiously, that's your business, your right. You should be whoever you want to be. That all of us should allow one another to be who we are and get on with it.
And yes, Russell does believe in a lot of this stuff. Russell clearly has been left-wing a lot of his life. And while he may believe in this stuff, his class reductionism and belief in like uniting all people means he has started to pander to the right wing, and they make up most of his audience now. So this was the funniest part of it for me, is based on what you've seen in this video. At 4:40, he starts to talk about giving plain facts and not amplifying certain narratives.
And that we should have a media that tries its best to give us plain facts and allows us to sort it out among ourselves through plain, honest, open discourse, not elevates and amplifies particular narratives to turn us against one another so that they continue to profit from their relationships with. Here on this channel, we're not going to allow that to happen. We're going to continue to tell you the truth because we trust in your ability to judge for yourself what's real and what's true, which voices are out to support you and which voices are out to get you.
But when talking about the trucker convoy, like I showed you, he used an article from Russia Today written by Ian Miles Chong, who has his agenda to support this stuff, and he didn't disclose it to his audience. So he says he will trust the audience to judge for themselves and what's real and what the real voices are. But if you don't tell people who you're using, then how can they judge for themselves? And also, I would say, using more fringe stuff like The Blaze and not telling your audience like where this perspective comes from is also disingenuous, because a lot of your audience are not going to have media literacy and won't know where the perspective of this outlet is coming from. You should tell them that. And then finally, he goes on to say, I don't want to control or trick you. I trust you'll come to the right conclusions if you're given the right information. And then also, everything we say on this channel, we say with evidence after diligent research by a team.
And another thing that I don't want to do is I don't want to control you or trick you. I trust that you'll come to the right conclusions yourself if you're given the right information. Everything we say on this channel, we say with evidence to back it up after diligent research by a team of hard-working people. That's the only reason we leave the ads on, because we've got to pay these guys, for heaven's sake.
So Russell, if you don't want to control or trick people, why don't you give them all the facts? Why don't you disclose all your sources? Why were you trying to hide that? Like, your source isn't muckrack. And here's the thing as well. This is one of the few sources where you don't disclose who the author is. So you didn't disclose who the author is on purpose, I assume. It's not an oversight. You're also trying to obscure where the article comes from by saying it's from muckrack when it's actually from Russia Today. If you actually trust the people to come to their own conclusions, if you give them all the information, then why didn't you tell them where this article came from? Why didn't you tell them where the author came from? Because that article fit into your narrative about the trucker convoy, which you supported. You wanted something to confirm your views, and you wanted to just bounce that article, act like someone else was legitimizing what you were saying. But in reality, this is written by an outlet which is owned by the Russian government, has a vested interest in stirring up these movements, and was written by a well-known right-wing troll. And the thing is, right, now I believe that maybe Russell didn't know this. So you got to question who is on your team that is constantly feeding you these really bad sources which have an agenda. Like, if you're using a source you're obscuring like that, the Grey Zone, the Blaze, and a lot of really fringe right-wing things, then it's really, really hard to trust you. And it's also really hard to take your criticisms of the mainstream media manipulating people when you actually are taking people whose whole goal is to push an ideological agenda. Sometimes even more than mainstream news sources. Like, I would trust The Guardian over The Blaze any day. I would trust even like more conservative outlets over The Blaze any day. I trust The Times over The Blaze. I trust The Telegraph over The Blaze, because The Blaze's literally whole existence is to promote conservative propaganda in a very, very unsubtle way. But the ultimate question is, like, why does Russell do all this stuff now? Why has he changed so much from his early days? And like I speculated in the last video, I do think it's a grift, and he's trying to be a YouTuber. He's not trying to be like a principled activist like he used to be. He just wants to be famous on YouTube now. I don't know his financial situation. I'm going to say that he's probably not doing this for the money based on having like a pretty good career. I don't know that for sure. But again, he's playing into all these very, very right-wing populist topics. Topics Tucker Carlson are constantly talking about. Topics Jimmy Dore are constantly talking about. Topics Tim Pool, the quartering. All these people are only talking about this, where Russell actually used to talk about interesting things, talk to people that no one really knew, take principled stances on very controversial issues, but now he doesn't want to do that. And it could be partly based on his class reductionist philosophy about bringing everyone together. But again, in my mind, it could also be like he doesn't want to upset his audience too much. So that's why he can pump out so many videos on Joe Rogan, Fauci, the trucker convoy, all that different stuff, while not actually talking about as much important issues. Like sometimes he will pay lip service to try and frame it like everyone is rising up against the establishment, but then he never advocates it from a left-wing point of view anymore. It's always from a right-wing populist point of view with right-wing populist language. And what actually happens then is you might get a lot of people in your audience who maybe want to see the end to like some sort of corporations like Facebook, who they think is like liberal or something like that, or like Spotify or any of these corporations they might not like. These people will never advocate for left-wing social causes. They will never advocate for the end of capitalism ultimately because they're so brainwashed by capitalism and they actually like it, a lot of them ideologically. So Russell is essentially pandering to these people, and I believe people like Tim Pool and Jimmy Dore do it for money. And with Russell, I feel like he does it because he wants to be a very successful and famous YouTuber who people take very, very seriously. Now, people have told me Russell Brand in his like football show or maybe some of his other work seems like the old Russell Brand, but for this one specifically, he's essentially pandering to this new right-wing populist audience, and I think he's just doing a lot of harm. I couldn't even talk about a lot of the medical misinformation he constantly pushes because unlike Russell Brand, I'm not a big YouTube channel. If I start talking about that stuff, I'm going to get flagged and I'll get my video removed. But if you want to go see some of that stuff, go check out his channel. It's basically all he talks about. So that is it for the two-part Russell Brand video. I hope I covered most of what you guys wanted to hear and wanted to see, because I know a lot of you have requested this for a long, long time. Let me know what you guys think in the comments about Russell Brand. I guess my conclusion is basically just, you know, principled left-wing guy, has some spiritual beliefs I don't agree with and find pretty out there, but maybe through his class reductionism and things like that, and maybe just grifting for ego reasons, he's essentially sold out to a right-wing audience that is growing on YouTube to become like their new messiah, essentially. Anyway, support me on Patreon if you want. Follow me on social media at the Kavernacle on Twitter and Instagram. Come join our subreddit. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.